John, you're going to introduce our speaker today. So,
I am. Today we have Kyle Minks with us. He's the Watershed Manager with the Dane County Land and Resources Department and has worked with the county since 2011. His responsibilities include coordinating the county's efforts in implementing the Yahara Winds Adaptive Management Project, assisting agricultural producers and landowners with conservation practice implementation, and implementation of the county's ongoing 2017 Legacy Sediment Budget Initiative. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point with a bachelor's degree in both biology and water resource management in 2007. And he attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, graduating with a master's degree in both water resource management and soil science in 2010. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks, John. I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully, and then we should be able to get started with the presentation. Are folks seeing the slide up there?
yes.
Great.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks again, John. I appreciate the introduction. As John said, my name is Kyle Minks, and I'm the Watershed Manager with the Dane County Land and Water Resources Department. And I'm going to present to you all today on a project that the county has been working on for some time now, since roughly late 2014, early 2015, which was the removal of in-stream legacy sediment, or as the Wisconsin State Journalist has coined, suck the muck. So I'll start there. The first slide I have kind of here is just there's two initiatives really that the county's been working on right now, and they sometimes get confused. The one I'm talking about today is called Suck the Muck, and that's in reference to the removal of the stream sediments or legacy sediment within streams. There's also another initiative right now that's called the Yahara River sediment removal, and that's really focused on the Yahara lakes and the chain and the Yahara River that connects all of those. Those are two different projects, and I just wanted to kind of point that out right away. Oftentimes it gets a little confusing when you're talking sediment removal, and it's easy to confuse the two. So to kind of give a little background and just kind of set the stage of how this project came about, back in 2008, the county, in partnership with the Department of Natural Resources and also the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, formalized and finalized what's called the Rock River Total Maximum Daily Load. TMDL is sometimes what it gets referred to. And what that project was is it took the Rock River Basin, in which about 2/3 of Dane County is located within. It's the eastern 2/3, including kind of the Yahara River system, chain and lakes, as well as kind of the Lake Koshkonong, or I should say the Koshkonong River watershed. And basically what that did is it identified the impairments that are within those watersheds. And the two major impairments are sediment and phosphorus, and it sets a target load of what we're trying to achieve and shooting for in the pounds that we want to see being delivered to the water bodies for phosphorus and sediment. Within those categories of pollutants, sediment and phosphorus, it breaks them down into two major sources: non-point sources of pollution and point sources. Point sources are those things like wastewater treatment plants or industries that have like a pipe that directly discharges to water bodies. Non-point sources are more kind of the diffuse sources of pollutants that are out there. This primarily within this watershed is agriculture. So nutrients and soil that sometimes occurs after rain events and runoff events get into the stream, and that's usually all identified as non-point sources. As part of that, what we do to try to mitigate those sources of pollution is called conservation practices or conservation implementation. So what the county does is it works with a lot of the agricultural rural landowners that are out there, and we try to find practices, they call best management practices or conservation practices, in trying to keep the soil and nutrients on the land and prevent them from getting into water bodies. So since probably 2008 especially, the county has really ramped up its efforts in trying to do that and identifying where sources of sediment and phosphorus are coming in from non-point sources and working with landowners to implement those practices. However, we've noticed We've also gotten a tremendous amount of water quality monitoring going on in this watershed, primarily in the Yahara, especially with our partnership in adaptive management and the WINS effort. And we're not seeing a whole lot of changes in the water quality. So that kind of begged the question for us to think a little bit more. Is there other non-point sources of sediment and phosphorus coming into our water bodies other than just agriculture? Is there things out there that we would call non-point, which is this big bucket that's everything but a pipe or a point source that may be impacting our water bodies? And one of those sources that we wanted to investigate was the sediments within our streams, or what we're calling in-stream legacy sediments. And this is just a little schematic here to help define what we call in-stream legacy sediments. And basically, they're sediments that are deposited from previous rain events. And when we say previous rain events, we don't mean rain events from last week or the week before, or even within the past couple years. We're talking rain events that occurred 30, 50, 80, even maybe 100 years ago. And these sediments get deposited within our streams, and we're wondering if those deposited sediments are still impacting the water. And to kind of just show how this works, these orange dots represent sediment on the land. We get a rain event. When it rains, those sediments get transported down to the stream. As I mentioned before, we put in what's called the best management practices. In this case, this is a grass buffer. So we try to buffer the stream corridor, prevent those sediments from getting to the stream. And during the next rain event, less of the sediment actually gets in. The buffer traps most of the sediment, but we're still getting some sediment delivered to the stream. And I guess our big question is, what's the role of these sediments that are within the stream that were deposited previously on the water quality? And the main reason we asked this question is about this time back in 2014, there was quite a bit of research coming out about legacy sediments and the fact that they can contain large amounts of phosphorus, which we know are a problem for our lakes and streams. Phosphorus contributes to algal growth and algae blooms. There also was research stating that they can mask a lot of the improvements that we see in water quality from some of the upland best management practices that we have implemented. In essence, what they do is we know that these BMPs help trap sediment and keep it on the land, but we're not seeing that necessarily in the water quality data. And so they call that kind of a masking of those improvements. And then thirdly, the other major factor is that they're really difficult to remove. A lot of our practices do a great job of trying to keep the sediment up on the landscape, which is great because you can work with it a little bit better. But once the sediments get within the water body, it gets really hard to get them out. So we decided to do kind of an investigation to understand if these sediments are impacting the water quality a little bit more. And we picked a small watershed up on the northern side of Lake Mendota called the Dorne Creek watershed, just kind of to the south of Wanakee, north of Middleton. And the main reason we decided to investigate this watershed was that we had two USGS water quality monitoring stations, one on Highway Q, if you're familiar with the area, as well as one on County Highway M, which was really great because it gave us kind of this controlled environment where we could monitor the impacts of the sediments as we investigated them and should we decide to move forward with trying to remove them. Another main reason we picked this watershed is that we've got probably over almost 30 years of working with the agriculture community up here on implementing conservation practices. So there's a high level of kind of this upland treatment from landowners on trying to prevent sediment and nutrients from getting into the water. And so it really presented itself as a great case study to really focus in on what's going on with just in the streams. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing we did with any kind of investigation is kind of to take measurements, right? And so we went into the streams in this particular area and collected water samples from just the water itself. We also then took over 50 core samples of the sediments themselves. And basically what that consisted of is we took these tubes and inserted them into the sediments in the bottom of the stream, and then extracted those sediments and partitioned them out into different layers. We could kind of use texture and feel to see the different settling out of sediments, and tried to pull samples from those and send them into a lab to find out how much phosphorus is actually attached to these sediments. And then here's just another picture of our partners with the Department of Natural Resources and us kind of going through that extraction procedure. In addition to that, then we also used a combination of the sediment cores that we took and the in-stream water that we collected and did what's called a diffusion test. So we wanted to see if the water that's on the top of the sediments was either taking phosphorus and nutrients out of the sediments and bringing it into the water column, or if the opposite was happening. Are these sediments taking nutrients out of the water and binding them and holding them into the bottom? And so we were able to set up this test with the State Lab of Hygiene, and they take this water and put it on top of our cores, and then they measure the water on top over the course of 10 days to determine whether phosphorus is coming out of the water or going into the sediments. So here I'm going to share some of the results that we found from those samples, but I wanted to share this quick video with you to just give you an idea of what these sediments look like within Dorne Creek. And I want to caveat this, that this is our partners with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And we always like to partner with them because they're the brave ones to kind of go in and look at this stuff before first and volunteer their services. So you can see there's quite a bit of what's considered kind of deposition or accumulation of sediments. In this particular spot here, it's not quite 3 feet, but a good 2.5 to 3 feet probably of materials, depending on where you're standing. And it's really kind of this gelatinous, gooey kind of material that just accumulates. And so we kind of knew that this was accumulating within the streams, and this really begged the question on, does this have an impact on it? And here's the results that we found. So the in-stream sediments, or this material that you see here, we tested for phosphorus, and it has roughly, on average, around 5,000 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus, or in other ways, 5,000 parts per million. So what does that mean? We can kind of compare this to concentrations of phosphorus in cropland fields that are directly adjacent to the stream. Those typically have concentrations around 700 milligrams per kilogram. And then we also went and sampled a barnyard or a direct feedlot, and those typically have concentrations around 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. So you can see that the sediments in the stream itself have somewhere, they're way more phosphorus than what the adjacent crop fields have, but not quite of what a barnyard has. And so there's a tremendous amount of phosphorus sitting there in the bottom of these streams. Once we knew what the concentration was, we were able to do kind of a survey of the stream and also estimate how many pounds of phosphorus are sitting in this 2.3 mile stretch between County Highway M and County Q. And we found that there's roughly, or we calculated there to be roughly 75,000 pounds of phosphorus just sitting in the bottom of this 2.3 mile stretch of stream. And to give a little more context on what that number means, 75,000 pounds is roughly the total annual loading of phosphorus to Lake Mendota from all 4 of its tributaries. So not just this one stream or this 2.3 miles, but all the tributaries that feed into Lake Mendota annually contribute around 75,000 pounds. And we found that much just in this 2.3 mile stretch. So a lot of phosphorus. In addition, we also did that diffusion test to find out whether phosphorus was coming out of the sediments or going into the sediments. And we found that roughly 0.075 milligrams per liter was the average concentration in the water column, in which it pretty much concluded that the phosphorus is leaching out of these sediments into the water. And what's interesting about this particular concentration is this is the target. So this concentration is what we're trying to shoot for in all of our stream water bodies. And that's how much phosphorus is just coming out of the sediment. So not including all of the stuff that's running off the land during a rain event, just the sediments themselves. So with that, we also decided we wanted to say, well, if we can go in and remove these sediments, how long would it take roughly for the phosphorus to get out of the system? If it continues to leach out phosphorus from the sediments, how long does it take before all that phosphorus leaches out? So we know what the sediment phosphorus concentration is. We know what this diffusion rate is, and we were able to do a calculation and determine that it would take us roughly 66 years before all that phosphorus leached out. So if we could turn off rain events, not have it rain anymore, the sediments alone in the stream are going to leach out phosphorus for the next 66 years. In addition to that, we also were curious, well, how old are these sediments? Are these sediments recently deposited within the last year or two, or are these from historical rain events that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago? And so we took different depths of samples and sent them into the lab, and they did radioisotope dating. And it was determined that when we went about a foot down into the sediments, those sediments are roughly 25 years old. When we went roughly 2 feet down, the age of the sediments was around 75 years old. And that really kind of hit the nail on the head for us to see that these sediments are old. These aren't things that are happening from a lot of the conservation work that has occurred within the last 15 or 20 years, but rather these are sediments that historically were deposited prior to a lot of those practices going in, and they're still having an impact on our water quality. So with that, now that we knew that there was definitely an issue with the sediments in there, we decided, well, let's see if we can pilot a project to get those sediments out. And so we decided to choose a section between that M and Q. We had some of our lake management folks assist us with that. And we set up a system that has a hydraulic dredge that would suck the sediments out. They would pipe them up to a dewatering area, which was a giant sediment bag that would hold the sediments, and the waters would leach out and return back to the stream. And we did roughly 250 feet in about 2 weeks. So we realized that this was super labor intensive, really hard to get those sediments out. And in that 2-week time, we removed roughly about 40 cubic yards or 500 pounds of phosphorus. But it was definitely a proof of concept to prove to us that, yeah, we can get these sediments out, which could really have a benefit to water quality. So with that, we decided to scale this up. So we went from kind of this pilot project of evaluating a small stream stretch and removing some sediments to really looking at all the tributaries that come into the Yahara system in particular. So this map here identifies roughly 33 stream miles that potentially have sediments in them that have a lot of phosphorus. And so the county worked with the Department of Natural Resources and are continuing to go into each of these stream reaches, pull sediment cores out, and evaluate to see how much phosphorus is tied to these sediments, as well as how much sediments have been accumulated. And since then, we've also scaled up the removal efforts. The first one being Dorne Creek, which occurred in roughly 2018. That project wrapped up. We did a stretch there, and then we also went in and removed sediments from Token Creek. With these projects in Dorne Creek, we were able to focus not only just on the water quality aspect, but also to expand these projects. We thought since we were going in, it also would be benefit to help restore some of the stream bank habitat that's out there. We also realigned the stream. What happened over the years was a ditch was dredged out, and the stream kind of got disconnected from its original course through the wetlands. And as part of the project, we kind of reconnected that to help not only improve the connectivity of the stream with the wetlands and hold some of those sediments before they get to the lake, but also it provides some flooding relief and creating additional storage as well during rain events. And then we also reclaimed a former gravel pit that had overgrown with invasive species, and we used that gravel pit as our dewatering basins and retrofitted those to help hold those sediments that we could later cover up and permanently stabilize. Then in 2019, we moved over to Token Creek. We identified that area also as having a significant amount of sediments with high phosphorus concentrations. And that project also was aimed at improving water quality, but we also were able to restore a lot of aquatic habitat. So Token Creek is one of the few trout streams that we have kind of in the northeastern portion of the county. And we worked with the Department of Natural Resources again on putting in different habitat structures, whether it's big boulders and rocks or woody debris for the trout to kind of hide underneath. We really emphasized that within this project as well, in addition to just removing the sediments. And it really enhanced a lot of the recreational opportunities out there within this particular area. It happens to be in one of the county parks and gets a lot of use from people either fishing or camping or using the park system. So our next steps are we're finishing up our assessment. This map here, every line that you see in red, assessments have been completed. So the last one that we have to do is over here in Nine Springs. We're hoping to do that one this spring. We just finished up Dorne Creek, which goes into Lake Kaganza this past fall, and finalizing that assessment to see how much sediment and phosphorus are in these different reaches. And then we're also starting to plan removal in Lake Mary, which is on the 6 Mile Creek, just south of Wanakee. This area had large amounts of sediment accumulation and has favorably high concentrations of phosphorus. I don't think the concentrations were as high as what we saw in Dorne Creek, but they certainly were higher than some of the phosphorus concentrations we saw in some of the upper reaches of, say, the Yahara River or even the upper reaches of 6 Mile Creek. And so, yeah, with that, we're just continuing to kind of do those assessments. We have a website here that folks are welcome to go to. We've got a lot of great videos if you want to see kind of some of the before and after progress of these projects. We were able to get someone in to do some video shooting of both Dorne Creek and Token Creek. But here's just kind of some pictures of what the sites look like in Dorne Creek before. So this was the stream. It was moving through the system and coming into this drainage ditch that you can see down here, and kind of short circuiting. And so what we did is we put a ditch plug in down here on this ditch and then reconnected it to the old stream corridor, which you can kind of see here is the old stream that was starting to grow in with vegetation, and most of the water was moving down through this system. So great opportunities to not only improve the water quality, but also restore a lot of that habitat. And with that, I can take questions if folks have any.
I have a question.
Yes.
Kyle, I know that the sediment removal on the Yahara River also has some other goals in terms of moving water down, through the chain and flood control and that sort of thing. But what is the pollutant profile look like on the sediment that's coming out of that river chain? Is it similar?
Sure. Yes. So when it comes to phosphorus in particular, there isn't a whole lot within the ones within the Yahara in that sediment removal for flooding. A lot of that material is sand, so it's a lot coarser material, and that material typically doesn't bind or hold nutrients as well as what we see in the streams themselves. Those are a lot finer, more of a silty kind of material that are really conducive to holding the nutrients. When it comes to contaminants or other pollutants, I don't know. I haven't investigated those too much. We did have to test all of our samples for contaminants on the Suck the Muck legacy project, but most of those came back with negative hits. Actually, all of them came back with no major concern. I think primarily because these are located in headwaters and kind of more agricultural environments than maybe some of the stuff you might find closer to urban areas where there's more industry. Does that answer your question, Stephen?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question about the weed. Are there a lot of weeds in there?
Yes, yeah, that was one of our biggest challenges when we decided to do that pilot ourselves. There is a lot of vegetative growth within the streams, and it made it hard for us to suck that material up. When we brought in a contractor to do it, they had a much larger hose and a bigger pump that was really able to take that material out and move it up easier than what our small little say 3-inch or 4-inch diameter hosing versus a 6-inch diameter hosing.
Well, do you attribute a lot of the weeds to the phosphorus?
Absolutely. Yep. There's a tremendous amount of nutrients there for plant growth, and that's a main reason why we see a lot of growth in the system. That and the accumulation of the sediments brings the vegetation closer to light, so light penetration can get to the bottom easier and promote that growth.
Is cutting weeds, is that something you can do, or is that kind of a futile?
It doesn't work very well in these streams because they're so small and narrow. It's tough to get equipment in there to remove that. But it does work in lakes, which are a little bit more open and there's less hindrance to navigation, I guess.
I have a question. more curiosity than concern. What do you do with all of the removal of your sediment, phosphorus, whatever? Where does it go?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was one of the major considerations when we were building the project to go and remove sediments, is where do we put it? For all of our sites that we've removed so far, we have disposal sites that fortunately the county have owned in close proximity to them. And so what you build is what we call dewatering areas on the upland where the sediments get pumped into, that water then drains back to the stream. And then once those sediments are dry, they get covered up with material and then reseeded down with permanent vegetation to help stabilize those in the landscape and keep them out of the stream. But you need relatively large areas to dewater because there's a lot of material. To put some perspective in that, Token Creek alone, I think, had roughly 20,000 tons of material that we estimated to pull out of there. So there was over 7 feet of that muck in the stream bottoms there that have accumulated.
Oh, maybe a question I have is that as you're doing this work, are you also building capacity within these streams? Obviously, Dane County is a high growth area. There's going to be more impervious pavement, building structures. We obviously had the flooding incident a year or two ago. How does that affect overall stormwater management and kind of capacity?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think these projects really work hand in hand with that. As I pointed out, especially in Dorne Creek, by reconnecting this to the wetlands, we've built that storage capacity to help mitigate some of that future rain events that we're seeing that tend to be pretty extreme. We also are trying to build in access to these streams, either through easements if they do come across private lands. Just to the north of Dorne Creek across County Highway Q was private land that we also removed some sediments on, and we asked for an easement. We said, can we come in here and remove the sediments, but we'd like to have an easement so we can, if need be, come back and help maintain and keep the improvements that hopefully we're going to see.
Got a question for you, Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, you said that a lot of this phosphorus leached in from agricultural land. What's the effect nowadays of like lawn fertilizer going into retention ponds, going into the watersheds, eventually getting into the streams?
Yeah, a lot of, well, I think from the lawn fertilizer in particular, that has definitely improved. A lot of our lawn fertilizers no longer have phosphorus in them. They do have other nutrients which can be a problem, nitrogen and other sources. But in particular for surface water, they don't tend to be as much of a concern because with the phosphorus removed. I would say as far as like the nutrients from agriculture, that's drastically improved. And working with a lot of the farms up here that have manure and nutrients that are going on the land, most of them have nutrient management plans. They're really watching when they're putting those nutrients on to try to maximize their return on the nutrient value that manure provides. So it's come a long way, I would say, since some of the historical practices that have been out there in the watershed.
Kyle, I have a quick question. You do mostly watersheds and streams, I see that, but you mentioned that you did Lake Mary. My question is would Patrick Marsh ever be one of those bodies of water that you would test for phosphorus, or do you know, has it ever been, and what's that one like?
Yeah, I haven't looked at Patrick Marsh, but I'm going to write that one down just to see if we have something close to that, and I can look and see. And Lake Mary, just to be clear, we haven't done anything there yet. We're just starting to plan that one. That might be one that we look to remove sediments in 2021 here coming up.
Okay.
But I apologize, I don't know for certain, Patrick Marsh, how that one looks.
No worries, I just was curious.
Mm-hmm.
Got a question about the phosphorus. Years ago, the laundry soaps had phosphate, and that was outlawed. And now there's been all kinds of other chemicals that are being used instead of phosphate. Do those alternative chemicals have any effect on the streams?
Yeah. I'm as far as the chemicals go, yeah, I would say a lot of chemicals out there we really don't want those in our water quality, or they do bad things for our water quality. The fortunate thing with a lot of the chemicals is they do get tested. EPA regulates a lot of those chemicals pretty heavily, a lot more than I would say nutrients. And so there is some assurances there that they're semi-safe for the environment, but I guess in my eyes, all chemicals in the water are bad things. So we want to try to keep as much of them out as we can.
Along that same line, I'm in the appliance business, and people are always complaining that these high efficiency washers aren't cleaning as well with less water. And so their solution too often is to put in more soap, try to clean better, and then rinse a second or third time and use more water. And I've been trying to figure out some way to educate people so that they can use higher water temperatures and less soap and less water, because even though higher water temperatures uses more energy, I think it's more important to get clothes clean by temperature instead of by chemical and water.
Yeah, no, good points.
Kyle, I have a quick question. What part of the plan do you have, like, so post removal, or is there any like continued mitigation efforts that look to manage the phosphorus that's already in the water? I know you mentioned like putting in vegetation, but like floating wetlands or things like that, is that part of what you work with?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So right now, one of the big things that we have is that continuous monitoring between M and Q. That's the main reason we picked that Dorne site, was we could really collect water quality post removal to see what impacts are still coming through the stream. We haven't had great data on collecting that because both 18 and 19 were extremely wet years, making them kind of outliers to see what the impacts are to water quality, but we continue to monitor and collect things there. We have thought about other types of in-stream treatment, whether that's collection basins for some more sediments to kind of settle out in, that maybe we can go in and remove on a more annual or routine basis, but we haven't tested any of those. We're floating some different ideas around, but to be honest with you, a lot of these are located in pretty sensitive areas, wetlands, and so we want to make sure that we're not causing more harm than good. Should we propose some sort of maintenance plan where we're going to continuously remove sediments or collect sediments in these sensitive areas? So I don't have a great answer for you yet, but we are posing ideas.
Bless you, Rose. Any other questions for Kyle? All right. Thank you, Kyle, for coming. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to let you know that for each of our speakers that comes and visits us, we make a donation in their name to the Home Mission Fund through Porchlight. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the club's focus this year is on affordable housing and assisting where we can. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.